The aerial photographs captured on November 19, 1978, presented an optical illusion that defied immediate human comprehension. From the vantage point of a hovering helicopter, the central pavilion of the People's Temple Agricultural Project in Guyana appeared to be surrounded by a vibrant, albeit chaotic, tapestry of discarded clothing. It was only as the aircraft descended through the humid equatorial air that the horrific reality crystallized. The vibrant colors were not garments left behind, but the bodies of hundreds of men, women, and children lying face down in the dirt. This was the Jonestown Massacre, a mass fatality event that would instantly overwhelm the capabilities of international law enforcement and push the boundaries of forensic science to their absolute breaking point. Initial reports transmitted back to the United States government drastically underestimated the scale of the crisis. The first Guyanese military units on the ground radioed a body count of approximately 400 victims, a number that seems staggering but logistically manageable for international recovery teams. The discrepancy arose from the physical arrangement of the deceased, who had gathered in tight concentric circles around the compound's central structure. As families succumbed to the lethal chemical mixture, they collapsed upon one another, creating dense layers of human remains that obscured the true magnitude of the death toll from both aerial observers and the first responders navigating the perimeter. The immediate and most relentless adversary facing investigators was not a hostile force, but the Guyana jungle itself, situated near the equator. The settlement was subjected to ambient temperatures exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit, coupled with near-total humidity. This oppressive microclimate acted as a biological accelerant, initiating putrefaction, the advanced stage of decomposition where bacteria multiply unchecked, breaking down proteins and causing the rapid liquefaction of internal organs. Within 24 hours of the mass poisoning, the remains were already bloating and degrading, severely compromising the physical evidence required for standard postmortem examinations and victim identification. The arrival of the United States military's graves registration units marked the beginning of a chaotic and unprecedented extraction effort. Soldiers lacking specialized biohazard gear or modern disaster response training were forced to manually disentangle the layered bodies. In this desperate phase of the operation, the fundamental principle of chain of custody, the meticulous chronological documentation of evidence, seizure, custody, control, transfer, and analysis, was completely shattered. There was no time to carefully photograph each victim in situ, tag their location, or collect personal effects with forensic precision, as the primary objective shifted rapidly from crime scene preservation to immediate biological containment. As the layers of deceased were systematically removed, the true horror of the body count revealed itself, climbing past 700 and eventually settling at 913 victims, excluding those who died at the nearby Port Kaituma airstrip. The recovery teams utilized heavy machinery and flatbed trucks to transport the remains to the local airport, a brutal necessity that further degraded the fragile bodies. Identification tags written on cardboard and tied to wrists or ankles quickly dissolved in the tropical rain and the fluids of decomposition, resulting in a catastrophic loss of preliminary identification data before the victims ever left South America. The logistical nightmare of transporting over 900 decomposing bodies across international borders required an emergency airlift operation of staggering proportions. The remains were placed into aluminum transfer cases and loaded onto military cargo planes, bound for Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, the site of the military's largest mortuary facility. By the time the first aircraft touched down on American soil, days had passed since the mass death. The advanced state of tissue degradation meant that visual identification by surviving relatives was not only psychologically traumatic, but scientifically impossible, forcing forensic teams to rely entirely on objective biometric data inside the sterile, refrigerated hangars of Dover. The FBI disaster squad initiated a massive fingerprinting operation. However, the epidermal layer of the victim's skin had begun to slip away, a phenomenon known in forensic pathology as skin slippage. To counter this, technicians employed specialized techniques, injecting a mixture of tissue builder and glycerin directly into the fingertips to rehydrate the pads and restore the friction ridges. When the skin was too degraded to remain on the finger, investigators carefully removed the epidermal glove and placed it over their own gloved fingers to roll a legible print onto the ink cards. This painstaking rehydration and rolling process yielded the first significant investigative victories. The FBI cross-referenced the newly acquired prints against civil and criminal databases, military records, and the internal documents recovered from the People's Temple headquarters in San Francisco. Through sheer volume and relentless effort, fingerprint analysis successfully identified hundreds of the adult victims. Yet this biometric triumph highlighted a glaring demographic void in the data pool, as a substantial portion of the deceased were minors who had never been fingerprinted by any government agency. To bridge this identification gap, the forensic teams pivoted to forensic odontology, the application of dental science to legal investigations. Dental enamel is the hardest substance in the human body, capable of withstanding severe environmental degradation and extreme temperatures. Teams of military dentists began the grim task of charting the dental formulas, restorations, and anomalies of the remaining unidentified victims. These post-mortem charts were then meticulously compared against ante-mortem dental records sourced from private practitioners in California, seeking matches based on the unique topography of fillings, extractions, and root canals. Despite the durability of the teeth, the odontological effort collided with a severe lack of ante-mortem documentation. The People's Temple was an insular community, and many of its members, particularly the children and the elderly, had not seen a dentist in years, or their records had been lost or deliberately destroyed. Furthermore, the children of Jonestown often possessed primary teeth with no restorations, rendering their dental charts virtually identical to one another. Without pre-death x-rays or detailed medical histories, the forensic dentists found themselves staring at perfectly preserved evidence that had no corresponding baseline for comparison. While the identification teams battled biological degradation, forensic pathologists faced the equally daunting task of establishing a definitive cause of death determination for the victims. The physical evidence scattered across the jungle compound provided a clear, albeit circumstantial, narrative. Investigators cataloged dozens of discarded syringes and large metal vats containing a purple liquid. Chemical analysis of the residue inside these vats confirmed the presence of potassium cyanide mixed with a combination of flavor aid and liquid tranquilizers, specifically Valium and Phenergan, designed to sedate the victims before the lethal poison took effect. Potassium cyanide operates by inhibiting cytochrome C oxidase, an enzyme critical for cellular respiration, effectively starving the body's cells of oxygen while the blood remains heavily oxygenated. The skin of the victims had darkened drastically, obscuring the lividity and eliminating one of the primary visual markers of cyanide poisoning. The initial global narrative framed the event as a revolutionary suicide, but survivor accounts and specific physical findings quickly shifted the investigative paradigm toward mass murder. According to the court records and testimonies of those who escaped into the jungle, many members did not willingly consume the lethal mixture. Witnesses detailed how armed guards surrounded the pavilion, and individuals who resisted were physically restrained. This coercion fundamentally altered the legal classification of the fatalities, transitioning the investigation from a mass suicide inquiry to the largest homicide investigation in United States history at that time. The physical evidence of this coercion was found on the bodies themselves, though the opportunity to document it was severely limited. During the chaotic recovery process, medical examiners noted puncture marks on the upper arms and backs of several victims, locations inaccessible to self-injection. These injection sites strongly corroborated the survivor testimonies of forced poisonings. Yet, because the bodies were processed primarily for identification and containment rather than criminal prosecution, meticulous documentation of these puncture wounds across the entire victim population was never systematically completed. This lack of systematic documentation resulted in a profound evidentiary void that would have crippled any subsequent criminal trial. Of the over 900 victims, only 7 official autopsies were performed at Dover Air Force Base, including the examination of the cult's leader Jim Jones, who died from a single gunshot wound to the head. The decision to forgo comprehensive autopsies on the remaining victims was driven by logistical necessity and public health concerns, but it permanently erased the forensic ability to legally differentiate which individuals committed suicide and which were victims of premeditated homicide. For the victims who could not be identified through fingerprints or dental records, investigators relied on rudimentary forensic anthropology. Specialists examined the skeletal remains and overall morphology to estimate age, biological sex, and stature. By measuring the long bones, such as the femur and tibia, and examining the fusion of growth plates, anthropologists attempted to create biological profiles for the remaining Jane and John Does. However, these estimations provided only broad categories, entirely insufficient for definitive legal identification without corroborating circumstantial evidence or personal effects. The most tragic limitation of these anthropological methods was highlighted by the unidentified children. The skeletal development of minors is highly variable, and without the precision of modern genetic testing. Dozens of children were categorized simply by approximate age brackets, their true identities lost within the margins of scientific estimation. The inability to name these youngest victims remains one of the most profound failures of the 1978 forensic effort, a stark reminder of the era's technological boundaries. The consequences of these scientific limitations culminated in a deeply somber resolution. Over 400 victims, the majority of whom were children, remained unidentified or unclaimed by extended families due to the intense social stigma surrounding the cult. In May of 1979, these individuals were interred in a mass grave at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California. The sheer size of the burial site served as a permanent, physical monument to the logistical failures and forensic impossibilities that characterized the aftermath of the tragedy. The catastrophic breakdown of evidence management in Guyana forced a reckoning within international law enforcement and forensic communities. The disorganized extraction and the loss of the identification tags demonstrated that existing military and civilian protocols were entirely inadequate for mass fatality events of this magnitude. Authorities recognized that relying on ad hoc graves registration units without specialized forensic training resulted in the irreversible destruction of critical data, prompting a total reevaluation of how authorities respond to mass casualty scenes. This reevaluation directly catalyzed the development of modern disaster victim identification protocols. Organizations like Interpol established standardized, globally recognized procedures for managing mass fatalities, emphasizing the absolute necessity of securing the scene, meticulously documenting remains in situ, and establishing a rigorous chain of custody before any movement occurs. The DVI protocols mandate a strict separation between the recovery phase, the postmortem data collection in the mortuary, and the antemortem data collection from families, ensuring that the chaotic commingling of evidence witnessed in 1978 is never repeated. The shadow of 1978 also highlights the transformative power of modern forensic technology, specifically the advent of DNA profiling. If a similar tragedy were to occur today, the extraction of DNA from bone marrow or deep muscle tissue would bypass the limitations of skin slippage and missing dental records. Forensic geneticists could establish familial lineages and identify every victim, including the undocumented children, by comparing their genetic markers to living relatives. The absence of this technology in the late 70s sealed the fate of the unidentified, locking their identities away forever. Beyond the scientific and procedural overhauls, the psychological toll on the professionals who processed the aftermath was profound and lasting. The military personnel at Dover Air Force Base, from the forensic pathologists to the logistical support staff, were exposed to an unprecedented volume of human suffering and biological decay. Many suffered from severe undocumented post-traumatic stress, as the sheer scale of the mortuary operation overwhelmed the psychological support systems of the era, highlighting a critical need for mental health protocols in disaster response teams. The chemical analysis of the scene, though overshadowed by the identification crisis, also provided lasting lessons in toxicological forensics. The rapid degradation of the cyanide compounds in the tropical heat demonstrated how environmental factors can completely alter the chemical signature of a crime scene. Toxicologists learned that standard testing parameters must be adjusted when dealing with accelerated putrefaction, as the breakdown of tissues can produce false negatives for volatile toxins, complicating the post-mortem determination of poisoning in extreme climates. The investigative reliance on the recovered documents from the San Francisco headquarters further underscored the importance of ante-mortem intelligence in mass casualty events. The FBI's ability to identify victims was directly proportional to the quality of the records seized from the cult's property. This established a critical precedent for modern investigations. The forensic identification process begins not in the morgue, but with the immediate securing of administrative, medical, and financial records associated with the victim's community or organization. The legal ramifications of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate criminal investigation, influencing how the justice system views psychological coercion and institutional control. The evidence of forced injections and armed guards dismantled the legal defense of voluntary mass suicide, compelling legal scholars to redefine the parameters of consent within high-control groups. The tragedy forced courts to recognize that extreme psychological manipulation, backed by the threat of physical violence, constitutes a form of homicide, fundamentally altering the prosecution of cult-related crimes. The forensic reconstruction of the Jonestown Massacre reveals a harrowing intersection of human malevolence and logistical impossibility. It was an event that broke the existing frameworks of death investigation, forcing a chaotic, desperate response that left hundreds forever nameless. Yet from this unprecedented failure emerged the rigorous, systematic disaster victim identification protocols that govern international forensics today. The legacy of the Guyana jungle is etched into every modern mass casualty response, standing as a grim, enduring testament to the relentless pursuit of the truth, even when the science is pushed to its absolute limit.